Hello everyone, Ian here. Welcome to Let's Study Horror Games, Episode 10. In the first half of 2010, things were looking kind of grim for the horror genre. Team Silent had disbanded, and Konami had passed the series off to a revolving door of Western developers, much to the frustration of fans who thought the series' tone had been lost in translation. Capcom had basically transformed the Resident Evil series into third-person shooters, with generic action crowding out its previously dominant horror elements. Alone in the Dark returned, after a long absence, with a critically panned entry. Some critics started wondering if the practicalities and economics of AAA game development in the HD era were endangering the survival horror genre. One of the earliest episodes of the long-running game analysis series Extra Credits asked where survival horror went, and gave a pretty dire prognosis for the genre's future in the HD era. Extra Credits' Where Did Survival Horror Go episode appeared on August 18th, 2010, and it did not age especially well, because just 3 weeks later, on September 8th, Frictional Games released Amnesia: The Dark Descent, proving that the horror genre was nowhere near as moribund as Extra Credits had predicted. Just as AAA studios were shying away from the genre for economic reasons, indie studios such as Frictional were getting in on the action, sensing a market opportunity for smaller-scaled, mid-budget productions that kept their horror undiluted. Frictional wasn't new to horror games. Its 3-episode Penumbra series, released between 2007 and 2008, was fairly well known among indie game enthusiasts, having been included in the very first Humble Bundle, ever. But Amnesia caught fire in a way that Penumbra hadn't, thanks to a variety of factors. One is that, although Penumbra looked fairly clunky, Amnesia's art reaches a crucial, good enough threshold, allowing it to appeal to a larger audience. Another is the gradual popularization of YouTube React videos, which would go on to be a source of crucial viral marketing for future indie horror titles, such as Slender the Eight Pages and Five Nights at Freddy's. There's also the fact that Amnesia is just better than the Penumbra games were. It sports an interlocking set of very smart design decisions, which together serve to make it very, very scary. Amnesia is in first person. This isn't a surprise. All of Frictional's games so far have been in first person, and there's a pretty straightforward reason why. Modeling and animating a player character is a resource-intensive process, and if you're a small, cash-strapped indie studio, it's just better to go without. There are some downsides to making a horror game in first person. For instance, you can't actually see bodily violence being done to your player character, but the trade-off is that you feel a much more immediate sense of presence within the game's environs. This had a definite effect on Amnesia's appeal, and in fact has had a long-lasting effect on the horror genre as a whole, with even long-running franchises making the switch to first person. I touched on some of Amnesia's other design strengths in episode 5 of this series. The game ensures that players always see and hear a monster in a scripted sequence when they're safe, as a way of alerting them to the danger of a space and avoiding unfair deaths that test the player's patience and disrupt their emotional engagement. It plays some tricks under the hood to ensure that players won't die in the same place, under the same circumstances multiple times, so as to avoid repetition and overfamiliarity, things that would disrupt the player's fear of the unknown. It also uses some light randomization to keep the machinery opaque, respawning the player in slightly unpredictable places upon death, and rearranging the position and patrol routes of monsters. And there are plenty of other smart design factors that contribute to Amnesia's tight construction. Having the ability to illuminate areas be tied to a resource you have to conserve and manage was a nice touch, as was the game's resolute avoidance of combat, continuing and expanding upon an experiment begun in Penumbra: Black Plague. And then, perhaps most famously, there's the game's depiction of mental health. Amnesia traffics in Lovecraftian themes. Its plot concerns academics and occultists who discover powers beyond human comprehension, opening up a crack that brings otherworldly forces and dangers into our plane of reality. It also borrows the theme of madness in the face of terrible knowledge, which is implemented in mechanical form. Catching a glimpse of one of the game's creatures, or alternately spending too long cowering in the dark without a nearby source of illumination, causes mental degradation, which ultimately has an effect on the game's presentation. The worse off your mental well-being is, the more the soundtrack will be filled with anomalous noise. Odd ringing and chirruping that seems to crawl through your brain on its way from one ear to the other. Cockroaches will crawl over the game's environs, only to be revealed as hallucinations seconds later. The game's visuals also get all squiggly, like you're looking at the world through frosted glass. Much like the game's first-person perspective, this squiggliness serves a practical purpose. If your view of the game's monsters is always smudged and indistinct, you'll never notice the imperfections of their models and animations. They're always indistinct and shadow-like, always kept to some degree in the realm of the unknown. So, fun fact. Although this little illustration of a brain in the game's menu functionally serves as a sanity level meter, Frictional doesn't outright label it a sanity level meter. And I'm fairly certain that this was for legal reasons. In fact, the very concept of a sanity level, which could be depleted upon encountering enemies and cause hallucinatory effects, had been patented during the creation of an earlier game. That would be Silicon Knight's 2002 GameCube exclusive, Eternal Darkness: Sanity's Requiem. Eternal Darkness has even more overt Lovecraftian elements than Amnesia. The plot directly concerns delaying the arrival of giant, tentacled old gods from our plane of existence. As a way of emphasizing the infinitesimal insignificance of any given human to these old ones, the player cycles between different player characters, who each won brief partial victories before driven to madness and terrible death for their encounters with the gods. Victory is only possible after 2 millennia's worth of groundwork had been laid, under the guiding hand of equally terrible rival gods. And as you might imagine, Eternal Darkness foregrounds its sanity level mechanic. The meter representing the player character's sanity level is presented in a very direct and transparent way, right alongside the hit points meter and the magic points meter. Once it dips low enough, the game starts indulging in a range of low sanity effects. These sanity effects fall into 3 broad categories. The first consists of perceptual hallucinations. The gaze of a bust will follow our character around a room. Blood will drip from the walls and ceiling. Rooms will turn upside down. Our characters will gradually shrink. Or they'll sink into the floor. We might be surrounded by zombies as soon as we enter a room, swamped and unable to fight back, and dying immediately, seemingly unfairly, only to have that be revealed as hallucination.
What's going on here?
Or we might have some good luck, discovering a fantastic cache of ammo, only for that to be revealed as hallucination.
This can't happen.
These hallucinations are motivated. They're to be understood as hallucinations that our player character is having. They're not that much different from the hallucinatory effects that will happen in Amnesia, beyond the fact that they're presented in third person rather than in first person. The second category of sanity effects is hybrid in nature. It combines hallucinations on the part of our player character with the game messing with us on the level of interface. Most of these have to do with the game's inventory. Our character hallucinates that their items have disappeared, and this is communicated to us at the level of interface, when we open up the inventory and it's empty.
Can't be happening.
Sometimes a character's head will randomly pop off. If you're quick enough, you can pick it up, and it will be treated like any other inventory item. If you don't pick your head up immediately, your other limbs will continue to pop off. If you try to equip a weapon once your arms are gone, the game will tell you can't, because you have no arms. The third category is those sanity effects that solely affect the game's user interface. There is no attempt to motivate these effects in terms of hallucinations on the part of our player character. Instead, the game directly pranks us as players. It leapfrogs right over our player character, and manipulates interface elements that reside completely outside of the game's fiction. The game simulates your TV turning off, or switching inputs away from your console. It simulates your volume turning down, or muting, using a design that strikingly replicates the UI of most consumer televisions in the late 90s. It's easier to spot this as a trick today. Contemporary TVs typically have much fancier UIs. It will occasionally give you a message that your GameCube controller has failed, or throw up a Windows-style blue screen of death. Probably the most notorious sanity effect occurs in rare instances after you've just saved. The game will suddenly ask you if you want to delete all saves, and offer two confusingly worded options. No matter which option you choose, it will simulate deleting your save files, down to erasing their icons one by one. It's a startling moment.
This can't be happening.
One that I have to admit successfully got me the first time I played the game. As players were so used to the game saving menu being a sort of sacred space, cordoned off from the rest of the game as a strictly non-diegetic act that ensures the game's usability as a piece of software. For the game to prank us in even this space, this safe little island when we can normally pause, breathe, and manage data, feels like a violation. Now, in terms of visceral reaction, I find playing Amnesia: The Dark Descent to be a much scarier experience than Eternal Darkness. Its sound design is more effective, swapping out the wall-to-wall music of Eternal Darkness with meaningful and foreboding sound cues. Its level design is better at crafting spaces you really don't want to advance into, and its oppressive, inky blackness is just simply more frightening than Eternal Darkness's often psychedelic Dayglow palette. I can sort of understand Eternal Darkness's embrace of bright colors as a way of differentiating itself from the dour murkiness of its console competitors, such as Silent Hill and Siren, but it frankly makes the game less scary. But despite all of this, I am impressed by Eternal Darkness in ways that I am not impressed by Amnesia. Pretending to delete a player's save files takes a lot of chutzpah. Amnesia's interface is, by comparison, much too safe. Daniel can be so far gone that he's seeing bugs crawling around on his eyes, but I always have the option of just pausing the game, and Daniel's madness can't get me here. Even when I have, ellipsis level sanity, what? This menu is a safe space. If I want, I can stick around and read every single journal entry. Then I close the menu, and Daniel's as mad as ever. Perhaps Amnesia would simply have been too scary if they mess with players in the menus as well. Perhaps they decided that they needed players to be able to pause and take a breather without having any nasty tricks played on them. But I have to say that ultimately, I find Eternal Darkness to be the more ambitious and provocative game, thanks to its willingness to cross this line, even if it ultimately is the less scary game. Everyone knows what an unreliable narrator is in literature. It's basic middle school English stuff. Other media have struggled with untangling what it means to have unreliable narration when the story is not being told through language, easily attributable to a human agent. There are examples of audiovisual unreliable narration in cinema. The Innocents directly shows us ghosts that the protagonist sees, despite otherwise encouraging skepticism towards her perception of the world.
Flora! Who is it? Over there.
In Takashi Miike's Audition, a seemingly benign conversation over the course of a date is edited in really strange and abrupt ways.
そんなに仲が良い家族というわけでもないですけれど、それほど悪くもないし、普通だと思います。
And later the film reveals that elements of the conversation had been strategically edited out the first time it was shown to us, to deliberately hide certain aspects of a character. So we have examples of unreliable narrators in written prose, and unreliable audiovisual narration in cinema. Eternal Darkness gives us a glimpse of an unreliable interface, one that has no compunctions about lying to us, even about crucial issues separate from the fiction, such as hardware functions and save data. Silicon Knights would go on to develop Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, the remake of the original Metal Gear Solid for the GameCube. This was a good fit for them. Along with its status as a landmark in the stealth genre, the Metal Gear franchise is also known for its cheeky experiments in breaking the fourth wall.
Snake, put the controller up against your arm.
What?
Don't worry, it'll feel good.
Huh?
Silicon Knights was able to successfully adapt some of Metal Gear Solid's most famous uses of the PlayStation hardware for the GameCube hardware, including the scene where Psycho Mantis peruses the save files of the memory cards you have inserted, which they put their own little spin on.
You like Silicon Knights games, don't you? Did you enjoy playing Eternal Darkness?
After this, Silicon Knights made 2 Human, which ultimately got them into some legal trouble. They broke the contract for the use of the Unreal Engine 3, refusing to credit Epic Games even as they used a ton of their code, and Epic sued them out of existence. They also forced them to physically destroy all unsold copies of 2 Human, which, that's the only time I've ever heard of that happening. So Silicon Knights is no more, and will likely never get a game that directly expands upon the themes and mechanics of Eternal Darkness. But thankfully there have been other developers that have continued to experiment with unreliable interfaces, specifically in a horror context. For my final case study in this video, I'll be turning to Blooming Bud Studios' Calendula. Calendula is a horror puzzle game, which sounds odd now that I say it out loud. We associate the horror genre with monstrous enemies, with forbidding spaces, and the threat of violent harm. Calendula has none of that. You basically just solve riddles, and you barely even leave the main menu screen. In fact, is Calendula even a game at all? I usually don't like to get in these sort of debates, but in this case the word game just doesn't seem to describe the experience in question at all. Calendula is a piece of software art that just happens to be sold on Steam, which we usually consider a storefront for games. But, not always? It sells other things too? Just about the only thing I'm really comfortable saying about Calendula is that it's a piece of software, that it likes playing tricks and practical jokes on its user, and that it exploits the creepier side of experimental moving image art. And even by having said that much, I feel like I've partially spoiled Calendula. So, spoilers ahead. Or spoilers behind? I don't know. It's hard to talk about Calendula, but I'm gonna attempt to do so. Calendula is a piece of software that is built on the Unity 3D game engine. It presents itself as a game. Each time you start to try playing the game, it throws you into a quite beautifully rendered hallway. You're able to take a few steps forward, before video footage gradually supplants the 3D animation, and eventually the screen goes black, and you're thrown back into the main menu. If you hit play again, you'll get an error of some sort. Calendula is, in essence, a litany of errors. A veritable symphony of errors. Every time you hit one of these errors, which increasingly as the game goes on have to do with an announcement that your save file is password protected, you have to dig into the game's settings and change one of them. Sometimes the setting you need to change is generally indicated by the error you get, or by the name that the game has given your save file. Other times it's more opaque, but you can always get a clue by hovering your mouse cursor over the little eye icon at the bottom of the screen. There you'll get a riddle, pointing you in a certain direction. The main site of interactivity in Calendula is not the 3D rendered space that's most recognizable as a game. Instead, it's the settings menus, where you adjust things like audio channels, screen resolution, brightness, and online connectivity. Frequent players of PC games will be intimately familiar with these menus. Usually the point is just to figure out what settings work best for your system, and then get on to enjoying the game. But the game of Calendula is in these settings. It's here where you encounter all of the game's riddles, and work through their solutions. If you trace the family tree of horror games from a certain perspective, Eternal Darkness begets Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Here we have another game with Sanity level mechanics, where encountering monsters ultimately leads to forms of hallucination. But something's lost in this lineage. If you look at it from another perspective, Calendula has a better claim to being the spiritual successor of Eternal Darkness. It doesn't have the Lovecraftian themes, the zombies and the revenants, the explicit sanity meter and sanity effects, but it does have the pranks, the combative use of the interface against the player. Calendula asks what would happen if you took the blue screen of death or save deletion moments from Eternal Darkness and made them the basis of an hour-long experience. It's definitely not an experience for everyone, and it definitely falls outside what most people's conception of a horror game is, but I have to say, I like it a lot. Okay, to wrap up this episode, it's time for some meta-discussion. In the very first episode of the series, I said that it was going to be of indeterminate length, and that I had about 10 episodes planned out. I've made some changes in the focus and order of things over the course of the past 6 months, but despite this, I've actually covered everything that was in my original plan in these 10 episodes. I've completed that plan. Does this mean that the series is over? I've decided no. In the process of making these initial 10 episodes, I've come up with additional ideas for about 4 or 5 more. But I don't yet have a solid plan for their ordering or for their release. Already I had a 3-month gap between episodes 7 and 8 when I decided to make some slight changes to episode order, so I'm very aware that a lack of a solid plan can slow me down a lot. I don't want to make any promises about the release schedule for future episodes, but I can promise that there will be some more content for the series in the future, even if it's released sporadically. So, until next time, keep playing, keep thinking, and thanks for watching.